Hi guys, we've been looking at this idea that everyone has a story, and it's something that I truly believe. I want to get to know everyone's story. I want to get to know who they are and what makes them tick and how they've been shaped and formed, and it all comes from this idea that everyone has a story, and also a commitment to the idea that all of our stories are important, and also an understanding that we are also caught up not only with our individual stories, but the bigger stories around us, the stories of our families, the stories of our workplaces, our education, the stories of the nations that we happen to be part of. So we have our individual stories, and there's bigger stories as well that shape us and form us. And those bigger stories, they can shape us or form us for better or for worse. And Christianity is one of those bigger stories. And it might surprise you to hear this, but it's not a story that's based on morality or a story that's based on judgment, but actually it's a story that's based on flourishing relationships. And I'm going to explore that a bit today. And when I talk about the story of Christianity, I like to think of it as the story of God, or the big story. And like any story, it starts at the beginning. So let me read to you some selected verses from the first chapter of the Bible. And the very first verse says this: "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Then God said, 'Let us make mankind,' or humanity, 'in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" So God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And then the last verse says this: "God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day." So the three main points of the first part of the big story, of the story of God, is that God is creator, that humans are made in the image of God, and that God made everything good or perfect. And when we talk about that, we're not just talking about the aesthetics of it all, or that's a big part of it, or we're not just talking about how scientifically it all works, although that's a big part of it as well. We're talking when God made things good, it's especially in the dimensions of relationship. So if you think about stories, it's pretty common for the beginning of a story to set up a goal or a purpose of the main characters, and it's no different in the big story. So we see here what the goal of God is, what the purpose of God is, and that is he wants to create flourishing relationships. All that he has done has led to a point where he can be in relationship with humanity, and humanity can be in relationship with him. And all throughout the first part of the Bible, if you take the time to read the first chapter of the Bible in your own time if you'd like to, we keep on seeing that this phrase comes up: God saw what he had made and it was good. And at the culmination of the story, as we just read out, we see God observes all his creative work, and the story says God looked at everything that he made and it was very good. And so if we're taking this idea that the characters have been introduced, and now the motivation of the character of God, what is God's motivation? What is his purpose? It's to create flourishing relationships. And he does that when he says that he looks over everything and he sees that it is all very good. And so at the end of the first chapter of the Bible, we see that relationships between human and God was made good, whole, unbroken, and flourishing. And relationships between human and each other, male and female, it was made good, whole, unbroken, and flourishing. And even relationship between humans and the rest of the creation, from the super macro of the sun and the stars and the moon, to the things that swim in the sea, and the creatures that crawl on the earth, and the creatures that fly in the air. The relationship between the rest of the creation and humanity was also made good, whole, unbroken, and flourishing. And so this idea of relationship between God, humans, and the rest of the creation, it's at the very center of the start of the big story. And actually, relationship between God, humans, and the rest of creation, it remains at the heart of the big story for its entirety. And so the big story, let me say this again, the story of God, it's not primarily moral. It is primarily relational. And when we have that language of good, the language of good here used in the first chapter, it's not a moral good, it's a relational good. It's not, because bad doesn't even exist at the moment. So it's saying that what is good is the fact that there is this relational interaction, this opportunity to flourish, this starting point that is going to unleash the greatest potential. And so let me say this: morality is not unimportant. Morality is important, but the flourishing of relationships according to God's story is of primary importance. Obviously there's overlap. Don't want to say that there's no overlap, but all relationships, that's that flourishing of all relationships, human to God, humans to other humans, and humans to the rest of creation. The flourishing of those relationships is at the heart of God's story. And so let me just draw on one of the implications of that, and I'm sure you'll come up with more. But where I live in Melbourne is extremely environmentally conscious. Our state member of parliament is a Greens party member, and for me, I've always thought, if God's story is true, well, maybe I haven't always thought this, I've come to think this. If God's story is true, Christians, the people who claim to believe God's story, should be some of the most environmentally conscious of all people. According to God's story, we were made to tend the garden and to expand its boundaries to include the whole earth, stewarding God's creation and cultivating its full potential. And this intended mutually beneficial relationship between humans and the rest of creations, it adds layers, I think, of deep meaning in so many parts of life, from the beauty of sunsets, the attraction some of us feel to nature through hiking or surfing or camping, or even the fact that we have pets that we love, and sometimes we love our pets more than we love humans. And I suppose that's okay. But this aspect of God's story, where everything is made good, God looks at everything and says it's very good. Everything is created good for flourishing relationship. This aspect means that I can see the work of God. I can see God at work in those who love their pets. I can see God at work in those who love nature. I can see God at work in those who are vegetarian or vegans or who are environmentalists. And I know I have a connection with them. I have a bridge of connecting with them. I don't need to stand in them over judgment. I can say, hey, you're working to bring flourishing relationships. You're enjoying something that we were always made to enjoy. We used to have neighbours, next door neighbours, who were vegans. Now, secular Australians, and they would never ever go to church, and that's okay. But we connected with them, and we got to know them, and we got to know about their, the fact that they were vegan. And I learnt that when I invited them to come over to a barbecue at our place, and over time we developed a great friendship with those guys. We're still in contact with them today. And Kira shared with them this aspect. Kira, my wife, shared with them this aspect of the story. This aspect of the story of that we were made for flourishing relationships. That's at the heart of God's story, the big story, and that we were made to flourish in our relationships between us and the rest of creation. And she shared that that she could understand why they were vegan, and she respected that, and because it's part of God's story as well. And for people who would never ever go to church, this aspect of God's story, shared as it was through relationship, it spoke to them deeply and gave them a lot to think about. And maybe this aspect of God's story is inviting you to think about it as well. If that's the case, I've got some questions here for you. Let me ask you this. Do you agree that God's story, the story of God, is not primarily about morality, but about flourishing relationships? Why do you agree, or why do you disagree? And why do you think that so many people think that Christianity is primarily about morality? How did that come about? Another question. Does this aspect of the big story, of this idea of that we were made for flourishing relationships, and even our relationship between us and the rest of creation, the environment, animals, does this aspect of the big story make sense of anything you've ever felt before in your life? Does it make sense of a sunset that you've appreciated, a hike that you've gone on, a pet that you've loved? Or does it make sense of, maybe those are all positive emotions, right? But does it make sense of even that strong emotion of anger that you might have felt at environmental destruction or environmental injustice? Something to think about. And finally, we've focused on human relationships with creation. But whether you believe the story to be true or not, what do you think a flourishing relationship with God is like? So there's three dimensions of relationships: us and God, according to God's story, us and other humans, and then us and the rest of creation. So how do you think that a flourishing relationship between humans and God, what would that look like? And if flourishing relationships are at the heart of God's story, how do you think God relates to the rest of creation himself directly? How does that, what do you think, or what would you like to think God's heart is for the rest of creation? And what can we learn from that? So there's some things for you to think about. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you come up with something really incredible and want to share it with me, then feel free to let me know about it. All right, thanks guys.